Thanks, everybody. We want to talk about what Ember's pitch is, right? Like, what do we talk about Ember as Ember fans? Sort of what is good about Ember, what is it good for, sort of, and maybe what is not good for, right? And how do we, how and sort of for what kind of project do we recommend Ember to our friends, right? And how do we make sure that the recommendations are so that they actually have a good time when they follow the recommendation and choose Ember for their projects. I think this is relevant because sort of getting a clear idea of what of these questions, sort of what's the pitch, what use cases maybe don't make so much sense for Ember and so on, sort of that helps us as a community sort of to more successfully pitch Ember and convince people to use Ember and so on, right? And it stops us from sort of ending up in conversations where we're comparing Ember to things that are very different, and then sort of we are losing in these conversations, as everybody probably has experienced before. So we don't do that as a panel. We want to do it as a group discussion. So I'm going to do like a little opening statement after this, or after sort of explaining how this works. And then I would like everybody here in the audience to join the conversation. Either sort of you can just raise your hand and I'll come to you with a microphone and you can sort of stay where you are, or you come on stage and sort of share your perspective here. So let's get to my opening statement, and then, like I said, after that, sort of you can all join the conversation. It's sort of deliberately sort of challenging people a bit, maybe, to sort of do a better job of starting a conversation. But of course, I have no intention to say anyone's work is bad or whatever, anyone did a bad job, right? I'm going to say a few things that might be a bit negative, right? But that's not to diminish anyone's work, so of course. So I want to say that before, because we all sort of are doing our best sort of to make Ember succeed. We all want it to succeed, right? But I think like nothing is better than deleting your own code, right? That you wrote a year ago. I think nothing is also better to stop sort of following goals that are maybe not reachable, right? Or sort of ending to spend time on things that sort of lead into a dead end. So now to my opening statement. I've wrote a blog post a few years ago about sort of how Ember is great and what is great for, right? And one central point of that blog post was the fact or the idea that sort of everything you see in your browsers sort of lives on a spectrum, right? Like on the one hand, you have static websites, like, I don't know, your bakery's website where they say when they are open or something, or maybe a newspaper. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, you have like proper web apps with a lot of complexity, right? That could be, I don't know, I guess, for example, the dashboard that Intercom builds, right? Where you see all of the sort of conversations you have with your users and so on, and all the back and forth and so on. Or I guess CrowdStrike has pretty complex dashboards as well, where you see all the security stuff that they have. So it's high complexity data, blah, 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 all that, right? And then in the middle, you have things that sort of are a bit between those extremes, like maybe classic e-commerce things, right? It's like mostly static, but there's a bit of like interactivity. You want to, I don't know, select the size and color of your shirt that you're about to order or something. So yeah, it's like semi-static with a bit of functionality. And sort of the point that I made in the blog post was that Ember is very good for sort of the right end of the spectrum here, like highly complex web applications, probably desktop first, stuff that sort of your users open in the morning and they leave open for the entire day or for weeks or month or whatever. So we have everything in Ember that we need to handle the complexity, right? And maintain these apps over many years, of course, right? On the other hand of the spectrum, sort of for static stuff, there is static site generators like 11t maybe, Astro or similar. And then in the middle, there is a bunch of stuff like maybe SvelteKit, Remix, right? Frameworks that sort of have sort of built-in or like pretty advanced stories built in for SSR, SSG, progressive enhancement, that kind of stuff, right? And Ember has none of that really, right? And it's kind of a horrible fit for classic e-commerce use cases. We did an e-commerce project with Ember many years ago, and I would never choose Ember for something like that again. And I would also not recommend Ember for anything like that to a friend, right? Because I know they will be disappointed. So maybe we can agree on that, or maybe some of you don't agree and share that later. But if we agree on that, what's the consequence, right? And I think the consequence is that we could sort of have more targeted conversations when we talk about Ember, more sort of clearer conversations, and we could spend our energy more like in a more targeted way. So, for example, we could stop talking about things like lighthouse scores when we talk about Ember, right? Because my point would be that for 99% of the Ember apps that we're all building, lighthouse score doesn't matter, right? Nobody cares about the lighthouse score of something like Intercom's dashboard app. We could challenge the idea of building static sites with Ember, right? Emberjs.com is built with Ember and uses Ember data to load content, right? I can see, of course, the point that Emberjs.com should be built in Ember because somehow it makes sense, but of course, Ember's also at the same time not really suitable technology for something like that. Also, the fact that the app that we use in the guides to sort of introduce people to Ember is an e-commerce application, right? Super Rentals. I think that's a bit weird because Ember is a pretty bad choice for building something like that, right? So maybe we should have a different application there. And there is fast food, for example, right? That sort of has quite some cost in terms of maintaining it and keeping things compatible with it and so on. And I would say if fast food is relevant for your application, sort of like server-side rendering is relevant for what you're building, right? Why are you using Ember in the first place, right? Maybe you should have chosen something else. So that's my opening statement, right? I would say Ember is very bad for a bunch of things, but very good for some other things. I would maybe say let's sort of market it as the framework for, I don't know, building desktop-first dashboard-style applications, and then sort of we can forget about everything else. We save a bunch of time and energy, and we have a much easier time to convince people. And what I would like to happen now is for people to react to that, maybe share their disagreement. Maybe you're all building web shops and are very happy with using Ember for that. Or maybe you agree, or maybe you want to just share something that's ideally related though.
Thanks, Marco. Just a quick one about the e-commerce store. I think when we look at when we look at young learners and trying to get them into Ember, does the nature of the application really matter that they're using learning, or is it the fundamentals that they learn? So I get it that, yes, Ember might not be the best for building e-commerce stores, so we maybe do not want to, I guess, use it to introduce people, but for learners, it doesn't really matter in the sense that they're more interested in understanding the basics of how Ember works as opposed to an e-com store or, a dashboard in that sense. Yep.
Who wants to respond to that? I could respond, but I would rather have someone else respond to that. Maybe on stage, even.
I thought I was done being up here today. Jesus. Okay. So,
He's on stage.
It's a funny one because almost all of the things that you mentioned that we shouldn't be using Ember for, I wrote most of that stuff. So, sorry, first of all, and it's a little bit annoying that you're my boss, so I can't directly say it's all wrong, but
no, please say it.
It's all relevant to the stuff that we've been working on. So Vite is a interesting technology because it takes away a lot of the stuff that we used to have to do ourselves. So a million years ago, if everybody remembers, there was this idea of starting with Glimmer and then npm installing your way up to Ember. So you could essentially build a framework that perfectly matches what you need along that spectrum that you had up on the screen. That didn't work. That was a failure. It was an experiment. But what we're looking at now with Polaris and some of the new stuff that's happening and a lot of the work that Ed is doing with the AMD resolver and some of the work that Preston is doing with like removing the barrel file in Ember, there is a future where maybe in the next 6 months, you could legitimately do Ember new, essentially stop importing the router and just render a component as like the only thing that you need in your Ember app. And then you've kind of done the opposite of not npm installing your way up to Ember. You've tree-shaped your way down to just Glimmer.js or whatever the project was. So there is an alternative future there where the tools that we're using can solve a lot of the problems and the pains that we are facing. And we don't even need to write all of that work because Vite is very good at finding the stuff that you have been using. And if we just don't pull the thread, if we don't import from at ember/router, that just won't be in the bundle. And that's huge. So if we can just essentially make our apps a bit smaller and only use what we need to use, we could target the full gamut, the full spectrum.
Any thoughts on that? Do you want to come up?
We have one here. Oh, we've got somebody coming up. That's good.
Yeah, maybe just both at the same time.
Come on for a second. This one on?
Test.
You can go first.
Thank you. Yeah, so I sort of agree with both of you. In that, yeah, it definitely, at the moment, it does feel like Ember is definitely more suited for the complicated app. But what is kind of like a reality, and if you work in a bit smaller company, is that, yeah, there may be a better framework for your static website, but like, do you have the time, do you have the resources to invest in that framework? Because you build your component system for Ember, for example, you build your tools, your libraries, and then you need to build your static app, and then you kind of have to start from scratch because you're using Svelte or something all of a sudden. And yeah, okay, you can like do clever things with CSS and like design systems that way, but there is like a friction if you're like using multiple frameworks in a small-ish company where you need to kind of learn double the amount of stuff.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be somewhere in between Chris and Marco as well. I think for most of the last 10 years, absolutely, we've been a framework meant for building data-heavy, interaction-heavy applications. And really very difficult to break out of that. But I also think that we've been very rapidly iterating to something that's a little bit more in the middle. I don't know that we will ever get all the way over to the left-hand side of I'm a content site. I don't even know if I want to work on something that does that personally. It's never been something interesting to me. But I do think a lot of things in the middle. And I think e-commerce is in the middle. And I think e-commerce is something that we could be really good at. When I look around at e-commerce sites today, and the bar is so low. It's so low. We can blow the baseline experience out of the water, I think. And a lot of what the work I've been doing on Warp Drive is intended to do is raise that baseline automatically for every app. And I think the same is true of the work we are doing with Vite. And I think all these things are coming together at the right time to give us this ability to not just say, okay, we're continuing to be a good story for the data-heavy applications. I think we're about to make a very rapid shift to the middle and say, no, actually, we're a good story for most applications. If you're interactive, if you have state, if you're loading dynamic data, if you want to handle caching, we're great for that. So.
I have one follow-up to Chris saying that, with Vite we could potentially be more adaptable to fit kind of everyone's needs. But my main question is, I guess, should we do that? Because I feel like there's a similarity with this discussion to the kind of broader discussion about front end and back end and using the same, like using JavaScript in both the front end and the back end, for example, and like that debate as to whether that's a good idea or not, or should we have something that's more purpose built for each kind of use case. And I really like that Ember is more, or is more purpose built for a particular type of application and can be really, really great at that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think when I said sort of Ember is sort of a very good fit for everything, sort of all the way to the right of that spectrum, I think it can extend like towards a bit to the left, a bit more, right? But not all the way, right? But then the question is, how far to the right can something like SvelteKit or Remix extend, for example, right? Like I would definitely, and we're doing that right now, I would definitely want to build an e-commerce application in SvelteKit, right? But would I want to build something like, I don't know, I don't really know the product, but presumably CrowdStrike's dashboard, would I want to build that in SvelteKit, or is Ember the better choice? And I think Ember is the better choice for that, right? So I think the clearer your idea is for what you are, sort of the more targeted sort of your investment, sort of the time and energy sort of you invest into maintaining and extending the thing sort of can be. And of course, it would in theory be possible, I think, to make Ember so that can cover like 80%, whatever, 90% of the spectrum. But do we have the time and resources to do that? Or does our history show us that we have sort of limited time and resources in terms of what work goes in to Ember? And is that a hint at making extra sure that we're focusing on one thing to be really good at that and not to be sort of somewhat okay at a bunch of things? Oh, sorry. One thing that I want to share, so when I talk about e-commerce use cases, I'm looking for stuff like being able to switch between SSG and SSR like per route, for example, right? I want this route to be sort of server-side rendered at build time, this is runtime. I want to have progressive enhancement, right, where something is a link, like a regular link until the JavaScript loads, and then I have client-side routing. Same with actions, like with forms, right? I can either sort of before JavaScript has sort of loaded and started, it's just a regular form, it's a post request. Once loaded, sort of the action runs in the browser, and that kind of stuff. And I don't really know too much about Ember internals, but I think that would sort of require sort of like a relatively fundamental shift on how the framework works building that. Or maybe not, yeah, awesome news.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing, is that I think I definitely see the point in like focusing, because focusing tends to, lead to good results, but also in extending at least, somewhat more to the left, because I feel like there are quite a few applications, at least in my personal history, where you kind of start more or less static, and then people just, oh, what about this kind of feature, and what about this kind of control, and what about something extra here and that, and at some point you're like, oh damn, like I wish I had more framework to work with, and then converting over is costly, and so it would be nice, at least if it would be a decent fit. We could still focus on one area, but being a decent fit in other areas is definitely valuable for maybe smaller, more agile or more volatile projects where you don't really know where you're going to end up when you start.
I'll take a turn. I like the prioritization framing of the question, and I think we could split it into two areas because there's both a technical prioritization and there's a messaging prioritization, right? And speaking first on the technical side, I think what Chris and other Chris have already said about it technically is what I would say as well. All the strategic work we're doing is about being able to spend all of our effort on the unique selling propositions of what makes Ember's technology good and leverage ecosystem technology elsewhere. And that gives us much of the kind of things that you're lacking without us building it. So I don't think we have to make a hard prioritization choice to say, like, how do we care about SSR? Like, we should just get it for free by doing it the stock way. Like, that's going to be the plan. So, like, go read the Vite's SSR docs and do that. That's going to be the instructions. We will not have to spend our development cycles on it. So that's partly why you got head shakes on the, like, could we do it without fundamentally refactoring? The answer is yes. Like, in the underside, like in the guts of these frameworks, they're not that different. I mean, there's different opinions about how data flow works and, like, the nitty gritty of the software architectures, but, like, they're all just a big function that makes DOM come out. And, like, they're very substitutable once you drop them into the right contexts, like Vite's SSR server or something like that. Yes, there's, probably user space libraries people would want to write to do native forms. Actually, an interesting refactor that just hit the teaching app is that it now uses native forms for when you're teaching inputs the first time in the tutorial app. So, like, all of that stuff is on the technical side. I think we don't have a hard prioritization choice. I'm less sure where to spend our marketing story energies, because it's true that it's harder to sell a product when you're trying to say, I'm everything to everybody. It's easier to focus your message on certain things. So that would be an area where I could see the argument that it's better to emphasize the things that people already recognize we're good at. Let's double down on that and not try to muddy the story by trying to say we are everything to everybody. I could see that as a prioritization decision. And I think that comes down to, who's out there evangelizing and who they're talking to. And also it's partly going to be feedback from what happens on the technical side as people are shipping things and realizing it's easier to ship things and talking about it. It can begin to start change the story too.
I think that segues pretty well into what I wanted to say as follow-up to this gentleman's feedback from earlier. Sorry, I don't know your name. I really dislike the premise of the question, actually. And the reason I really dislike the premise is it puts us in a position to chase a specific definition of technological buckets that I don't believe need to exist. And I don't think that anyone has architecture figured out yet. SSR versus RSCs versus just server actions, where we're running queries, whether we're doing local first with replicache versus only server-side rendering, HTMX's action style. There's places for all of these things. It's definitely a continuum, no one answer, but also I don't even think there's clearly defined buckets of apps that fit into each of those paradigms yet. I think we're still pretty far from figuring that out. And if we start isolating ourselves towards one definition of application, we're basically saying we're done innovating. And I don't think we're done innovating. I think we're still innovating quite a lot. And I have a lot to say about what I think the server story should be. And I don't think SSR is it. I don't think RSCs is it. I think you ought to be able to write your backend in any language. There ought to be a clean separation, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be building a bridge between the two. I still want typed end-to-end API contracts. I still want to have that confidence. I still want to be able to optimize things by going to the server when I want. But does that mean I want to write all my APIs in JavaScript? No, it doesn't at all. So I think that we have to be very careful not to say, oh yes, we are the framework for data-heavy applications. I think that actually just puts us in the wrong footing.
I mean, I can see the point. I would just say we need to deal with the current situation as it is now, right? You can say we are a bit worse for that than them, but they are also not perfect because there is a better future ahead, right? I would not say that helps us really, because they are still better. They are still the better choice for that kind of thing. Right?
It's absolutely true that if I were trying to advocate for Ember's usage in an application today, I would mostly still, even today, target a data-heavy application. Right? Like that is the bread and butter for us right now.
Yeah.
So speaking of the situation as it is now, if you know the APIs or are curious around your package boundaries, you can make Ember work in Astro. Using the same APIs that Fastboot uses. All they need is render to string, and then if you want post-page render interactivity, a rehydrate method. And then Ember is compatible with Astro, and then you have static site content that works with like mostly Markdown, which is super cool. And it's kind of that same process for integrating with most of the ecosystem. Is just kind of like finding the API boundaries and like wiring it up.
I think that we tend to look at this a lot from the technological perspective, which is fantastic, but at the end of the day, we're just trying to build products, right? And Marco, what you said about, I would not recommend Ember for A or B. I vehemently disagree with it because there's certain nuances to that. So I remember, I think it was maybe 6-7 years ago, Chris, I don't know if you remember, but you once actually mentioned to me why I wasn't recommending Empress instead of ViewPress on Twitter. And the reason around that was because the client who I was working with at the time basically had the Vue ecosystem within his product. So it didn't make any sense to do that. Now, as an engineering manager, it's always cost versus benefit, right? You always have to do that analysis. So I wouldn't say, no, I'm not going to recommend Empress for, so let's take, for example, Forest, where I work as a senior engineering manager. If we were to build out maybe some static blog or something, I wouldn't go off and say we should use ViewPress when we're heavily embedded in the Ember ecosystem. So we probably have a messaging problem here. There are certain reasons why Ember is good, and why even if it might not be the perfect for a certain type of application, I would still recommend it. We need to remember how stable Ember has been. Now, I'm not going to mention, but as we all know, there are some other libraries or frameworks as they're framed out there. And if we want to talk about stability, we can just look at version numbers, for example, and how far off. So I wouldn't go as far as saying Ember, like we wouldn't recommend Ember for certain projects. I think we should have certain nuances to that before we make those kind of declarations. Yep, thank you.
Sure, fair point. It was a bit of a simplification, sort of my opening statement for sure. Do we have anyone else who wants to join? We kind of have the usual suspects on stage now, which is fine.
Yeah, get me out of here. I already have to talk later.
Yeah. Well, he did kind of set us up and say, like, if nobody talks, you have to go up there.
We can do the same thing with ViewPress too. They use Markdown it for their extraction of code blocks, and we can put Ember in there if you just hook it up, like Astro. I like supporting other ecosystems too.
I'd like to add my little response to the original question. Like, I think ultimately, Marco, you've got a really good point about focusing our marketing efforts. We should be targeting certain things and kind of making sure that when somebody thinking of building a certain app, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh, Ember is good for that, and that is useful. But we can't leave out everything else. We can't ever communicate the opposite, because a lot of the time people get exposed to new frameworks when somebody goes home on the weekend and builds a personal project with a framework, and then they come in and say, oh, look what I built, it was cool. So you have this idea of the weekend warrior, which I think Yehuda usually talks about, that they need to experiment with something, they need to feel the joy of building something in that framework, and then 90% of those times they're picking the wrong tool for the wrong job, but that needs to be okay. And we need to lower the cost of like, you have picked the wrong tool for the wrong job, and you don't need to be like stabbed in the leg for doing that. It needs to be like good enough for a very wide thing, but perfect for one specific thing.
And I think one thing we often forget, especially with the people that were up here who are all super smart, technologically heavy people, is that I think the thing that we could market more is you, and specifically with the Discord. No, but I think for me as a non-Ember developer who got roped into this community in 2018 by running around in a hamster suit in Portland, and now being part of the core learning team and working on the website redesign and being able to kind of invite people here to speak on stage. So Mo, who's going to speak after this, I roped into doing a lightning talk in Rome, and now she's a speaker. And I hope everybody met really nice people here. And I think that that's one of the things that keeps me sold on Ember, is that as soon as you're in the Discord and somebody is asked like, hey, I have a question, there's always somebody there to help, usually you, but luckily also other people. When there's the question like, where should I find the docs? Is the docs official? Then our answer is yes. That's the place where you go to learn about Ember. And I think that is something that we should not underestimate, that the cool group that we have here is also a reason why you should and could keep investing in Ember. Whoa.
Hello. One thing to add on top of that is there's more to Ember than the technology side of it. That detail to me is forgotten when I think of the reasons why I chose Ember and why I'm sticking with Ember, which has little to do with the technology. It's the commitment that Ember gives you, the stability for one, but one big value of Ember is how good it is to take a developer and level that developer up. That is a value that is easily overlooked and underrated when somebody's picking up a framework in today's world. And I think we are in a unique position in where we are to say we are very good at that. I would not be where I am today without Ember, and I think that says a lot about the framework.
Thank you.
I'd like to add to that. I think this is also the part of the thing that we need to improve as a community, because it feels to me like Ember has a lot of things figured out. The thing that we are the thing that we are missing is a good documentation on how to build Ember projects, because that's where other people could also benefit from. Like I've been off Ember for the last project, doing a bit of Svelte on the side, and I noticed like, oh yeah, there's a lot of patterns I really like that Ember does well, that are ingrained into the whole ecosystem, into the whole structure, that would benefit in all other places as well. So I wonder if we could like extract something like a manifesto for how to build applications the Ember way, from how we do them. And everybody knows, like everybody here in this room probably has some idea of like how Ember does projects and how we maintain this. And I'm wondering if we could document this more and actually preach it to others, because the way we build projects with Ember is, I think, one of the best ways to build front-end projects in general, and is what, yeah, made my life for the last decade. So I'm really happy about that.
I think there's something really interesting there in that for as small as our community is, our core teams are actually quite large and very diverse and cover a lot of ground. And for better or worse, that might actually harm our documentation story, because we don't have the same single focus point, this is how you build with X framework perspective that some communities do. If you were to talk to YCATs about how to structure an application versus Ed, how to structure an application versus myself, how do you structure an application, you're going to get 3 different answers.
That's why I started my own tutorial. But the learning team does good work. I don't want to subvert that. I just wanted to tell a story in a different way.
Oh, absolutely. And we're really struggling right now on this with Warp Drive, right? We're going through a really big transition from what were the legacy patterns of Ember data into a very different set of paradigms now. We've been working to build new docs, working to build new guides, but it is, how do we tell the story of this is how to think about it and this is how to build in this architecture is not easy, especially because what we're saying is actually a little bit different from what the framework is saying right now. Because you don't see Ember concurrency in our patterns. You don't see resources in our patterns. Our version of how you do async and lifecycle management is just a bit different. And it's not that it's a bad thing, it's not that it's incompatible, but it means that there's not like a shared architectural understanding. And I've had this premise for a while that actually, a whole lot of how we build applications ought to be centered around our data patterns. And a lot of the story itself, how do you construct your application, how do you lay it out, ought to be done around our data patterns. I really appreciated Gosi's talk earlier because of that. But that is a different opinion that you will get from many other people on these core teams. And that's okay.
Yeah, but that's also like you even considering how do we do documentation, how do we present this, how do we explain the transition. That's a bit that seems to be very ingrained into the Ember community. Like this community is one of the few I know that is really good at like pushing for documentation, pushing for a help team and for like support to be available. And that's something that I've seen here first before I saw it in any other framework. So I think even if there's different patterns to it, the general principle still stands.
We really need to wrap up, and I think we have 2 more questions though, right? So
okay, I can try to add just one point of view.
Yeah.
I think the marketing point of Ember is important. And sometimes when you try to find someone to work on an Ember project, it's not hard. It's hard because there are not so many. I mean, in the JavaScript ecosystem, Ember is something separate, a bit isolated, and there are many JavaScript developers around, and it's not easy for them to come inside an Ember JS project. And what we saw this morning with Vit and Chris showing us how to use a regular JavaScript package that you can find on the community, to me, this is a very important selling point because we're opening up to the community to tools that people like and love to use on weekend projects that make them happy. And with what's happening today with Vit and the way we are changing the build system, to me, this is going to change a bit how Ember is seen inside the community and how easily we can find more people to work on this project and more people to be happy because they'll be able to experiment and use stuff that they've been using on other projects, other frameworks. So this is, to me, an important selling point.
Last comment, and then
I will
we have
just go quite quickly. So just a quick follow-up to what he's just said as well. I think that it's important to realize that it's not just the responsibility of the steering committee or the learning teams to actually put Ember out there. It's actually all our responsibility as well. I remember in 2018, it was myself and Jessica at the GSConf EU, and people were actually quite surprised that Ember was actually still existing. We did manage to get a few Finnish companies actually, and we ended up using Ember. And Chris is actually going to ViteConf as well to basically talk about Ember. I think it's important that we also take the message of Ember outside the Ember community toward the JS community so people can actually see how awesome it is. Yep, thank you.
For sure. Great final words.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating in the discussion, in the conversation. I hope you all found it helpful, entertaining maybe. Also, I want to say I like Ember, right? We're co-organizing an Ember conference. Maybe I was a bit too aggressive in the beginning. So yeah, thanks. I think we have a short break because we ran quite a bit over, and then a 5-minute break, and then next talk. Thanks.